I worked at Six Flags last spring/summer. Well, technically a freelance arts company leasing vending spots there. I was one of the oldest people hired, being 18 at the time. I just started attending college, while most of my other coworkers were still in high school. I took photos in a sort of old-timey dress-up shop. It was honestly one of the most fun jobs I've ever had. I was hired back in March of 2018 and started work in April. This was when the park was open on weekends only, before the official opening. I had been working for about a month, and the park was now open during the week as well, for less than 10 hours per day. I was able to work all day long pretty much, but was unfortunately the only one in the shop, as college was on summer break, and high school was still in session until mid-June. I'm sure you can tell where this story is going. I was alone all day during the weekdays, and only had coworkers on the weekends. I was so terribly alone during the day that I'd just walk across the path and watch my other coworkers doing things out of boredom. When I was outside of my shop area during the day, I began to notice that a man had started hanging around my area. I'd mainly see him walking by very slowly and staring at me, not blinking the entire time. I figured he was just a shy guy that wanted a picture inside and was too afraid or socially awkward to come in and speak to me. Deep down, he did give me an uneasy feeling, but I decided to ignore it. He was a customer in the park, and so far he hadn't really done anything to me. I kept a smile and tried pulling in more customers all day, every day. One day, I smiled and waved at him. That was probably my big mistake. He walked over briskly to stand in front of me and just kinda stared at me. I was creeped out and kind of scared of this guy, honestly. After like a full minute of just staring into my soul, he asked about the prices. After days of walking by and staring at me, I breathed a sigh of relief and started going through my memorized sales pitch. After I finished, he started to smile. It was not a normal smile though. It was the kind that makes your skin crawl. He leaned in so close to my face that I could smell his breath. He asked how much it would be for him. I was confused as I'd just gone through my price list, so I stated that the prices were set and non-negotiable unless you were an art company employee or a park employee. He shrugged and just walked off. As I ran through my pitch to others during the day, a family had grown interested and wanted to take some pictures. I gladly took them into the shop and had a wonderful time photographing them. While I was checking the family out and collecting their payment, I looked up and saw the man was back. He was leaning against the chain barrier in front of my shop. The family collected their things and walked over to the chain. The man had to move to the side for me to open it for them. I immediately closed it behind them as he tried pushing his way inside. I told him I was sorry, but only paying customers could come in. He wasn't allowed to do so unless he was considering a purchase. He frowned and walked away. I waited a few minutes, tidied everything up, and stepped back outside to continue working. It was almost closing time, so it was kind of pointless. But I had to stand outside and try to get more customers anyway, or else I'd get in trouble with my boss. I noticed the man one additional time that day. Across the way from me was a kind of carnival game or something. I could see him hiding behind it, peeking his head out and looking at me. I can't tell you just how eerie that sight was. He continued to do all of this for the entire week, and eventually I just learned to ignore him, which apparently he did not really like. On that Friday, as soon as the park opened, he startled me by making a beeline towards me. I was out front organizing outdoor props, and I froze. I hastily dropped what I was doing and went back inside, closing the chain behind me. The man paced back and forth in front of the store, muttering to himself and looking at me. I was so terrified, I was going to run to the phone and call security. He suddenly lurched forward, grabbing the chain in both of his hands. I'll never forget this moment. His eyes were completely wild, and he had that same menacing grin. He started whispering about the things he wanted to do to me. It was disgusting. He started ranting about how much he loved me, and we were meant to be together, how he wanted me to put him in a dress and humiliate him in front of all the people in the park. I was slowly backing up to the wall in my shop as he started laughing and yelling hysterically. I told him to go away and that I was going to call security. He got even more angry and said something that still keeps me up at night to this day. Even if you do, I'll be waiting for you when you get out. Meet me by the employee exit on your way, or else. He gave me that same disgusting smile and walked away. I went behind the counter and tried to compose myself. I never imagined I'd have something like this happen to me, let alone at work. Now that I had, all my knowledge of what to do went out the window, and I started crying like a little girl. I decided to tell my manager at the end of the day because I didn't want to be afraid of coming into work. When I told him, he was completely mortified that I hadn't told him sooner. He walked me to a secret exit of the employee parking lot so I wouldn't have to deal with the man. The next morning, we went to the security office, and I gave a description to all of the park security of what he looked like and what he would normally wear. I went back to my shop with 2 coworkers. Not even 5 minutes later, there he came strolling over with an angry look on his face. I hadn't ran into him last night, and he was furious. My coworkers noticed my panic as I ran and hid in the back. I hadn't told them about my situation yet, and when I did, they told me they would not leave me alone even after their shift was over, so the guy couldn't get to me. I called security and told them what he was wearing, so they updated the information. They posted an officer outside my shop as well. The man seemed to disappear because of that. When the officer had to leave to take care of something for a moment, though, he immediately came back. Security realized that every time a clothed officer was around, he would hide away, so instead they posted a plainclothes officer across from my shop, posing as a customer. I was being used as bait ultimately, but I felt it was important to get a guy like this out of the park. Security eventually apprehended him later that day as he was heading towards my shop again. They asked me for identification on him, and I remember breaking down and sobbing. The officer comforted me. Finally, the nightmare was over. He never physically threatened me or wielded a weapon, I guess, but he was doing enough verbal threats to make me fear for my life. They banned him from all 6 Flags parks in the country, revoked his membership status, and took him into custody as well. Unfortunately, as there was no violent acts committed, they had to let him go. As I drove home that night, I saw him walking on the side of the road. I immediately sped away, in fear he would see me through the window and try to do something to me. At least he couldn't get to me at work anymore. I found a couple of weeks later from one of my security friends that he saw my stalker being arrested in a town over. I went and looked up the public arrest records for that town later that day and saw he'd been arrested for indecent exposure, public endangerment, and public intoxication. I know what happened to me might not be as severe as some other stories, but it was one of the most terrifying weeks in my life. You really don't think something like this will happen to you until it does. I'm a woman and am now 23. This happened around the time that I was 15 years old. I've had a couple of encounters that have been very creepy, but this one had me shaken to my very core. Around this time, it was my sophomore year of high school. A little backstory to understand the story I'm about to tell. At the time, I was kind of going through a phase, as most teenagers tend to do. I wore short shorts most of the time and fishnets as well. My shirts weren't really tops that a 15-year-old should wear, I think, but you know, we still do. I cringe at my outfits back then and my makeup, but that was just how it was. I was involved with my high school color guard. We're a part of the band, except we don't play instruments. Instead, we spin colorful flags. We also used rifles and sabers in our performances. Around this time, it was the fall, and we were practicing our show. We were doing a lot of reruns to try and perfect it before the usual competitions would start. Normally, practice would start at 4 and end at almost 9. Side note, I did not live close to my high school like most people that went there. The drive would take at least 15 minutes. Walking from my house to school would take about an hour, and taking the bus would take 45 minutes. My brother at this time worked late hours, and my parents didn't get off work until midnight. My next best choice was to take the bus home. The neighborhood was not the worst, but it wasn't safe enough to be walking home alone at night. Even before this night, I had always been a little bit on edge going home. On this particular night, I was saying goodbye to my friends and not wanting to bug them for a ride, so I walked over to my bus stop. I had my cell phone out and was scrolling through Facebook. I would occasionally glance up and check out my surroundings when I noticed a car slowing down in front of the bus stop. It immediately signaled to make a turn to my left. I didn't really think that much about it, since there are houses behind that area. It wasn't that weird until I noticed this car doing that again and again and again. I get scared easily and am already a paranoid enough person, so this had my alarm bells ringing right away. It wasn't until he had basically passed me by for the 7th time in a row that he parked on the curb by the bus stop. That's when I got a better look at him and took in his appearance. This happened a couple of years ago, so my memory is not perfect. I do remember he seemed to be Hispanic and reminded me a bit of an uncle of a friend of mine. His first words sent me panicking. To translate what he said to me in Spanish, it was basically him saying, "Hey, come over here. Do you need a ride? Hop in, I'll take ya." He kept saying that for 5 minutes like a robot, then just drove off. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding in. I was trying to calm myself down and tell myself that that was it. But I knew it wouldn't be, and I was unfortunately right. His car showed back up not long later. The thing about my bus stop is that there's a bunch of houses right behind it. Before the houses is a good amount of space with only dirt. Cars can actually go in this area, and I've seen it before. For some reason, it shocked me to see him drive around the back and park right behind me. At this point, I was panicking, and tears were falling down my cheeks. I was already thinking I'd never see my family again, because this man was surely going to try and take me. I was frozen in place. I already knew that in crucial moments like this, my reaction is to freeze, not fight or flight. Freezing is what I do. I still believe it was the prayers I was saying that saved me. At the exact same time the man began to approach me, these two big bulky guys walked close by. They appeared to be walking their pit bull on a leash. I'm a sucker for dogs, but at this time I couldn't speak or say anything. I was still in my frozen state. I knew this was my only chance, and I fought to get those words out. They kept catching in my throat. It was my only chance to save myself, so I spoke out in a shaky voice. "Excuse me, please, can you guys stay with me? That man over there won't leave me alone. I'm very scared." My words were choked up, and I was shaking at this point. The guys were very kind-hearted, thankfully, and agreed to stay by my side. To come off as more intimidating, they even crossed their arms across their chest and flexed their muscles. They stared down the man, who at this point got back into his car and began reversing. He drove off, and the guys stayed with me until my bus arrived. The time when this all ended was 9:59. I know some of you might be asking, why didn't you just go back to your high school? Well, at this point in night, no one would really be there. Mostly everyone else had already gone home. I did have a cell phone, but no one was going to be able to pick me up. The bus was my only transportation at that time, and I didn't know that Lyft or Uber existed. Actually, I'm not even sure it was a thing back then. Overall, I'm just happy to have been saved that day by the kind-hearted men. I hope one day I can see those guys that stayed with me and thank them for what they did. Because of them, I'm still here and able to share this story of mine. I'm still shaken up at the memory because of the scare it gave me. After that incident, I asked for a ride for the remainder of that season. Sometimes, even when you don't want to bug people with things, it doesn't really hurt to ask. It's better to be slightly annoying than to find yourself in a bad situation. You can always apologize to your friends, but you can't come back if something bad happens to you. This happened a few months ago in the beginning of summer. I've held off on sharing it for so long because I didn't want to be judged for my actions. I joined a stupid online dating app. I divorced just last winter. I was kind of living it up, you know. I somehow matched with this man who lived in New York, an 8-hour drive away from me. After texting for a few weeks, he sprung it on me that he was going to drive down to see me. Since I'd been staying with my family ever since the divorce, I decided we'd get a hotel. He told me to find one and he'd pay for it. I already felt super bad that he was driving so far, so I was trying to find good deals and the cheapest place that wasn't sketchy as fuck. I live about 40 minutes outside of the city in the state that I live in, and I'm not super familiar with some areas. The hotel I booked ended up being no bueno, but I didn't know this until I got there. It was dark by the time I arrived after getting lost 4 times. There was a very shady motel across the street, with 2 men smoking cigarettes on the porch. Lots of trucks and truckers traveling through too. I was walking into this hotel thinking, well shit, I fucked up. I just went with it anyway though, because I didn't really have a choice. NY, what we'll refer to the man as, was about an hour away, so he'd be there pretty soon. The hotel was run by Jamaicans. I think a whole family. This comes into play later, which is why I mention it. The woman who checked me in was fairly nice, but the whole place just gave off some weird vibes. The lighting, the heavy smell of bleach, the strange carpet, I don't know. It was really bright but also really dark, if that makes any sense. I started shaking as I was trying to check in. The reservation was under NY's name. At first, she told me she couldn't find it. His last name was Spanish, so I thought maybe I was pronouncing it wrong, even though I'm pretty good with my Spanish. This made it awkward, because now she knew I was meeting a stranger. I thought maybe he gave you the wrong name, she had said. I nervously chuckled. She put me on the 2nd floor. I was expecting an elevator, but as I turned, I saw that behind me was a huge carpeted staircase. I get to my room and just pace around, waiting for this stranger from the internet to show up. It started raining. I was sitting by the window sipping a glass of wine when I see a pickup truck pull up. I think maybe it's him. A man in a black hoodie gets out and locks his truck, about 50 beep beeps or so, then runs inside. I started panicking, thinking it was him. He had no bags or luggage. Maybe he was just coming to kidnap me or something. There was a loud knock at the door. I jumped hard and immediately stood up. I made my way over to the door and looked through the peephole. It was NY. No black hoodie, carrying all his bags with him. I cracked the door and smiled. He came in and I shared my terrifying thoughts with him. We chuckled and had a laugh together. Sex happens, of course. Later that night, we were falling asleep. He was spooning me, but also had his arms all the way around me, with his head on top of my head. I was awoken from a dead sleep, sweaty because he was holding me so tightly. I thought that was what had woken me up, but then I heard it. Someone was fucking with our door. I heard the handle moving, as whoever it was tried to open it, but it refused to budge. NY jumped out of bed so fast, I wondered how long he'd been awake, listening to this to react so quickly. I pulled the covers up to my chin as he was standing in the dark in his undies looking at the door. He looked through the peephole and said he thought it was one of those Jamaican men who worked there. We had a chain on the door, as well as the locks, so he kept the chain on and opened it a few inches. Before he could even ask what the man wanted, the guy just called out, "Is the white girl in there?" I remember getting chills all over my body. NY said no and slammed the door in his face, almost completely unbothered by this. The man said something about needing a credit card from me. NY yelled back that the room was on his card under his name, and he'd take care of it in the morning. I looked over at the clock and it was 2 a.m. I turned over and stared at the wall, hoping to fall back asleep. NY wrapped his arms around me again and immediately started snoring in my ear. Good thing he was hot. The next morning, we decided to get some breakfast. It was super early, and we were both feeling groggy from last night. I'm hoping that as we round the corner to the stairs that no one is at the front desk. They definitely heard the noises from our room, and I was feeling really embarrassed. That was when I saw him, an older black male, standing a few feet from the exit. Honestly, I don't know if he was Jamaican or if he was part of the family who owned this place, or a guest or just someone else. I don't know. His face was sunken in, and he had a weird chilling look in his eyes. He was staring right at me. I knew without even seeing him last night that this must have been the same guy. NY whispered for me to just keep walking, so I broke eye contact with him and leaned into NY as we made our way towards the exit. As we passed by, the man was silent. Then, as I'm pushing the door open to exit the building, he suddenly calls out, "There's the white girl. I found the white girl. She makes a lot of noise." NY snorted, but I was terrified. I left for work after breakfast. I was gone a few hours and returned to the hotel to find the room empty. I texted NY and asked where he was. He texted back saying he was in the laundry room and he'd be right back up. I sat down on the bed waiting for him. I heard some footsteps outside the door, the floor creaking, like someone was standing out front shifting their weight back and forth. I figured maybe NY forgot his room key, so I got up to look through the peephole, only to see it was not him. The creepy man from before was standing outside the door, just staring in through the peephole. I jumped back and started crying. I called NY and yelled for him to come to the room quickly because the man was outside the door again. He was gone by the time NY arrived. He went down to the front desk and spoke to the woman about this man. She just kept saying she had no idea who he was talking about and that she would keep an eye out for him. That night, obviously, I had a hard time sleeping. I felt like I could feel him lingering around outside the door, but I was too scared to go and look to check. NY was of course sleeping soundly. He was still a stranger, but he was the most comforting thing I had. We checked out the next morning. I grabbed his hand as we made our way down the stairs, because guess who was standing right there? Yeah, the woman from the front desk was now gone, replaced by a younger male. The creepy man was smiling as we neared the bottom of the stairs, his awful, bone-chilling grin. "Lucky man with a white girl," was the last comment we heard from this creep. NY spun around and told him to fuck off, then walked me out to my car. He waited while I drove off to make sure no one followed me. I don't know, maybe there's more we could have done. But again, the guy didn't actually do anything technically. It was just a very unnerving experience. About a month later, I was telling my dad about it. He laughed and told me I had picked the worst part of the city. He thought he'd heard about this place being shut down multiple times for either drugs or sex trafficking.